The wind swept across the stone courtyard of Greystone Castle, carrying a cold dampness that cut through Mara Whitfield's wool coat and sent a shiver down her spine. She paused at the edge of the courtyard, the rain-slicked flagstones glinting under the pale light of the swollen moon. The wolves were restless tonight, their low growls vibrating in the still air, ears flicking toward every shadow. "Why are the wolves restless tonight?" she whispered, her voice nearly swallowed by the gusting wind, clutching the scarf around her neck as if it could shield her from more than just the cold. Her breath formed small clouds that danced in front of her face as she scanned the courtyard, heart fluttering with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. The storm clouds overhead thickened, rolling across the sky like dark seas, obscuring the edges of the castle towers and casting shifting shadows over the wolves pacing anxiously beneath the parapets. Every now and then, a flash of lightning illuminated the courtyard for a heartbeat, casting the animals' forms in stark relief and revealing the tension in their coiled bodies. Mara took a careful step forward, her boots scraping against the wet stone, and the wolves reacted immediately, their heads snapping toward her with a collective alertness that made her chest tighten. She could feel the energy of the pack like a tangible force pressing against her, cold and electric, stirring something primal in her own pulse. The courtyard was vast and empty, save for the glint of rain on the edges of the stone and the shadows of the wolves, but a movement at the edge of her vision froze her in place. A shadow flickered atop the parapet, shifting against the tower walls, impossible to define, too deliberate to be a trick of the storm, yet fleeting enough to suggest it could be anything. Mara's heart pounded as she tilted her head, trying to make sense of it, every nerve alight with cautious curiosity. The wind gusted again, tugging at her coat and tangling her hair across her face, and she tucked a loose strand behind her ear, unable to look away from the subtle sway of the shadow. The courtyard seemed to shrink around her, the storm's roar muted by the tension in the air, the wolves now silent but alert, sensing something she could not. She swallowed, her throat tight, and took another measured step forward, boots slipping slightly on the wet stone, and the shadow shifted again, just beyond the edge of the light, impossibly still yet undeniably present. Mara's fingers brushed the cool stone railing at the edge of the courtyard, grounding herself, but the sensation only sharpened her awareness of the invisible observer. The cold air, the low rumble of distant thunder, and the scent of wet stone and fur pressed against her senses, making the courtyard feel alive, almost sentient, as if it were holding its breath along with her. She paused, chest rising and falling, listening to the subtle scrape of paws and the occasional snap of a twig, feeling a mix of fear and exhilaration that made her pulse quicken. Every instinct told her to look up, to search for the source of the shadow, but her gaze wavered between the restless wolves and the dark outline above, heart hammering in quiet panic. A moment stretched, suspended in time as she sensed, without seeing, a presence just beyond her reach, watching her every movement. She tightened her grip on her scarf and took a hesitant step closer to the center of the courtyard, letting the wet stone murmur beneath her boots, and the shadow remained, teasingly poised, impossible to read. The storm seemed to wait with her, each flash of lightning a heartbeat illuminating the wolves' tense forms, the shadowed parapet, and Mara herself, caught in the fragile space between curiosity and the unknown. And for a moment, just a moment, the wind stilled, the wolves froze, and the shadow lingered, silent, unreadable, yet undeniably watching, leaving Mara with the unshakable, lingering sense that she was not alone, and that something unseen had begun to mark the night in ways she could not yet understand. The courtyard had quieted under Mara Whitfield's tentative steps, but the storm had moved eastward, leaving a damp mist that clung to the castle walls and settled into the shadows of the narrow corridors. She drew in a shuddering breath, the scent of wet stone and pine, needles pressing in on her senses as she followed the echoing drip of rain through the castle gate. "You're far from home," a low voice murmured from the arched doorway, carrying a weight that made her chest tighten. Mara froze mid-step, heart hammering, the words lodging in her throat like stones. She could not see him clearly, only the outline of a figure backlit by the flickering torchlight, the dark cloak merging with the walls, and yet there was a presence she could feel, measured, deliberate, compelling. She shifted slightly, brushing damp strands of hair from her face, every nerve alert as the figure stepped forward, and she caught a flash of sharp eyes, cold, silver, assessing, and felt a curious mix of fear and fascination curl through her. The castle halls were narrow, lined with dark oak paneling that smelled faintly of wax and damp, their surfaces catching the muted light from torches and reflecting it like silent witnesses to her trepidation. Rainwater trickled from the parapets above, leaving tiny rivulets that glimmered in the torchlight, each sound amplified in the stillness of the corridor. Mara gripped her coat closer, each movement cautious, toes brushing against the wet stone floor, the echo of her own footfalls sounding unnervingly loud. The figure moved with a quiet authority, boots scraping softly against the flagstone, and Mara realized she could not tell whether he was guarding her or merely observing, but the tension in the air made it impossible to ignore him. Her eyes followed the motion of his cloak as it brushed the edges of the hall, subtle, controlled, and yet filled with an energy that demanded attention, like the first breath of a storm before it breaks. A candle flickered dangerously in a draught, and Mara instinctively reached out, steadying it, glancing back at the figure who had not yet spoken again, whose presence alone seemed to warp the air around her. She could sense the weight of him, the cold command, the quiet expectation that hung between them, and her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her satchel, realizing that every instinct was focused on this unseen observer, who remained just beyond the edge of her perception. The damp chill of the evening pressed in on her, seeping through layers of clothing, yet it was nothing compared to the awareness of being watched, measured, and silently understood in a way that startled her. Mara's pulse thrummed in her ears as she took another tentative step, the torchlight dancing across her profile and glinting off the edges of her damp hair, and she could not help but glance up at the shadowed archway from which the voice had spoken, the outline of the figure momentarily illuminated, and then swallowed by darkness again. Every breath seemed drawn out, suspended in the heavy air, her curiosity mingling with caution, the corridor stretching ahead like a threshold she was not yet ready to cross. The figure remained silent, still, and undeniably present, a tension that held her attention hostage, leaving her both anxious and inexplicably drawn forward, uncertain of what his intent might be, and yet compelled by the unspoken gravity of his presence to continue into the depths of the castle with measured, cautious steps, the lingering sense of eyes upon her forming a quiet suspense that clung to the mist and shadows, compelling her, and the audience, to wonder who he truly was and what the night would demand of her next. The mist hung thicker in the courtyard as Mara Whitfield stepped closer to the restless wolves, her boots pressing cautiously against the wet flagstones. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel as she crouched slightly, attempting to project calm into the nervous pack. "Stay calm," she murmured, her voice a soft thread over the low growls, careful not to startle the animals further. Each word was deliberate, a rhythm she had practiced silently in her mind, and her body swayed gently, matching the subtle rise and fall of the wolves' tense movements. A staff member from the castle appeared at the edge of the courtyard, their voice sharp and concerned. "Mara, step back. They will bite if they are startled." But she did not move. The warning fell into the night, carried away by the wind and rain, unheard by her determination to soothe the pack. The courtyard felt impossibly large now, yet claustrophobic at the same time, the walls closing in with shadows that shifted unpredictably in the torchlight. Every flicker and glint of wet stone reflected the storm's memory, and the wolf's eyes shone like amber in the darkness. Mara's chest rose and fell rapidly, pulse thudding, as she took another tentative step toward the center of the courtyard. The scent of wet fur mixed with the earthy tang of the moss-covered stone, pressing in on her senses, making her acutely aware of every breath, every movement. Just beyond the archway, a shadow stirred, sliding silently across the damp flagstones, a presence she could feel but not see clearly. Her ears twitched at the faintest scrape of stone beneath boots too large and deliberate to be casual, and a ripple of awareness traveled through her, heightening every nerve. The wolves stiffened, sensing the subtle tension in the air, and Mara's gaze darted to the source, her body instinctively coiling in preparation for anything. The figure remained cloaked in shadow, movements measured, deliberate, a quiet force that seemed to both threaten and protect at once. Mara swallowed against the rising fear, her hands tightening around the edge of the stone railing, grounding herself while her heart raced in unison with the pacing of the wolves. She took another careful step, letting her voice rise just enough to carry over the soft patter of lingering raindrops. The animals paused, their heads tilting as if listening not just to her words but to her intent, and in that suspended moment, she sensed the unseen observer shifting closer, a deliberate presence brushing the edges of the torchlight without breaking the shadows. Mara's focus remained on the pack, on the rhythm of her own breath, on the rise and fall of her hands as she coaxed the tension from the wolves, but the awareness of someone or something watching added an almost electric charge to every movement. Her feet slipped slightly on the slick stone, and she bent to steady herself, the near misstep sending a small, nervous ripple through the animals, but they held, mesmerized by her calm persistence. The shadow lingered, almost hovering, every subtle movement deliberate, a silent pulse that mirrored her own cautious rhythm. She did not look up, and yet every fiber of her being was aware, every nerve vibrating with the delicate balance of curiosity and fear. Each step forward was both command and question, a challenge to the darkness beyond the archway, a tentative invitation to the presence she could not yet name. The wind whispered through the castle walls, and the mist coiled around her coat, pressing against her shoulders as if urging her to continue. And still the shadow remained, impossibly still yet undeniably present, a silent witness to her courage, leaving Mara suspended between the instinct to retreat and the irresistible pull toward the unknown, the night thick with tension, expectation, and unspoken promise that the next step could change everything. The mist lingered in the courtyard, curling around Mara Whitfield like a soft veil as she knelt beside the wolves, her hands tracing gentle patterns over their fur, coaxing their tension into stillness. The air smelled of wet stone and pine resin, sharp with the lingering breath of the storm, and every footstep echoed through the castle walls, carrying weight and caution. She was unaware of the faint movement along the parapet above, where a figure had lingered in the shadows, leaning lightly against the cold stone. Julian Hawthorne's silver eyes glimmered with quiet fascination, watching the delicate control in her gestures, the measured cadence of her voice that seemed to reach into the animals' restless minds. Such courage in someone so small, he whispered to himself, the words barely more than a breath, yet carrying a weight of recognition that tethered him invisibly to her. The wolves paused under her touch, ears tilting toward her heartbeat, their amber eyes reflecting the flicker of torches that lined the castle walls. A sudden gust of wind tugged at Mara's coat, whipping damp hair across her face, and she shook her head, focused entirely on the rhythm of her song, unaware of the attentive gaze that followed her every movement. The torch flames wavered in the draft, sending dancing shadows across Julian's face, highlighting the taut line of his jaw, the sharp angles softened only by the quiet depth in his eyes as he observed. He stepped slightly closer, careful to remain in the darkness, boots pressing lightly on the wet stone, a subtle promise of presence that she did not know was there. Mara's fingers brushed the edge of a stone railing, grounding herself, but the faint shiver that ran through her arms was not solely from the cold. It was the sensation of being witnessed, evaluated, yet not intruded upon. The wolves settled fully beneath her touch, their bodies relaxing in measured sighs, and for the first time, the courtyard seemed to hold its breath along with her. The storm's echo receded, leaving only the muted patter of dripping water from the towers, the mist hovering low, and Julian's quiet presence like a shadow tethered to the periphery of her senses. She exhaled slowly, the sound swallowed by the damp air, heart still fluttering with cautious triumph, entirely unaware of the careful calculation in those hidden silver eyes. Julian shifted slightly, adjusting his stance to block a corner of the courtyard from the swirling mist, a subtle act of protection, almost invisible, yet instinctively grounding her in a space she did not know needed guarding. The night pressed in, cold and expectant, and every flicker of flame, every ripple of mist, became a silent witness to the delicate intimacy forming in that charged space, a quiet ballet of courage and observation, vulnerability and restraint. Mara rose slowly, brushing water from her coat, her movements deliberate, unaware that the careful observer above mirrored each step, body language synchronized to her rhythm, a silent acknowledgment of her strength and tenderness. She paused at the far edge of the courtyard, eyes sweeping the now still wolves, and for a fleeting heartbeat, sensed the invisible weight of eyes upon her, a presence that was steady, patient, and profoundly aware. A single torch flickered, casting light across the courtyard, revealing the damp stone and the calm wolves, yet the shadow from the parapet remained, a silent sentinel. Mara hesitated, chest rising with a mixture of relief and uncertainty, and the air seemed charged with the unspoken question, who had been watching, and why did the simple act of her song draw such careful attention? The mist curled at her feet, carrying with it a tangible suspense, leaving Mara suspended in the courtyard between calm and curiosity, and the distant shadow above promising that the next movement, the next sound, would draw her into a deeper, unforeseen tension that could not yet be named. The courtyard had quieted into an almost sacred stillness, the mist curling around Mara Whitfield's ankles as she adjusted the folds of her damp coat and took a cautious step toward the stone railing. A low wind whispered through the castle towers, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth, brushing her hair across her forehead and tangling with the scarf at her neck. "You should not be here alone," a voice said softly from the shadows, measured and precise, pulling her gaze upward without revealing its source. Mara froze, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the stone, breath catching as the presence behind her became almost tangible, a protective weight pressing against the cold night air. Her pulse quickened, not with fear alone, but with a growing, inexplicable sense of being watched with careful attention, as if every movement she made was significant. The torchlight wavered across the courtyard, illuminating the wet stones in patches, and in those brief flashes, she glimpsed the shifting outline of a figure, cloaked and still, the cloak catching the light like liquid shadow. A loose stone at her feet skittered as she adjusted her footing, and in the same instant a boot, silent, deliberate, pressed lightly to halt it from sliding further, a subtle intervention she could not yet perceive. Mara's eyes swept the courtyard instinctively, scanning for the cause, but found only the calm of the wolves and the rippling mist, leaving her suspended between relief and heightened awareness. The wolves, still attentive to her movements, shifted their weight softly, ears flicking, sensing something she could not yet name. She exhaled slowly, tracing a pattern along the surface of a low stone wall, letting her fingers catch the moisture and rough texture. Grounding herself, but every nerve remained alight with anticipation. The wind gusted again, pulling her hair across her face, and she brushed it back, heart tightening at the sense that the shadowed presence had moved closer, narrowing the space between them without stepping fully into the light. Mara's fingers clutched the satchel at her side, instinctively curling around its strap as if it could anchor her, and she felt a subtle warmth, a quiet gravity that made her chest tighten, the sensation both protective and slightly unsettling. Every glance toward the parapets and archways revealed only shifting mist, yet she could feel the calculated proximity of the observer, a tension that both drew her forward and made her hesitate, balancing on the edge of curiosity and restraint. The flicker of a torch caught the edge of the figure's cloak again, and Mara's breath faltered for a moment, realizing without knowing why that she was being measured, understood, and guarded in equal measure. She straightened slightly, heart hammering, aware that the silent attention had shifted from distant observation to subtle, protective alignment, a shadow mirroring her every movement with an intensity that stirred admiration she could not yet name. The mist hung heavier, curling around the stone and the settled wolves, and Mara paused at the edge of the courtyard, balancing on the boundary between calm and alertness, sensing that the unseen presence was not only watching but waiting, a careful, deliberate companion to her every measured motion. The night felt suspended, each breath, each flicker of torchlight, each small movement of the wolves a quiet signal in the unspoken dialogue between her and the silent figure in the shadows. Mara's gaze swept the courtyard again, uncertain, curiosity mixed with tentative trust, and the faint, deliberate steps of the observer, light against wet stone, pressed the awareness into her chest, leaving her poised on the precipice of discovery, anticipation curling around her like the mist, unresolved and impossible to ignore, drawing her forward into a night that promised revelations she could neither see nor name. The castle corridors felt heavier as Mara Whitfield stepped away from the courtyard, the damp mist trailing her like a ghostly cloak. Torches flickered along the high walls, casting long shadows that stretched across the wet flagstones, and each step she took echoed sharply, a metronome marking the tension that tightened around her chest. "They say the Alpha King is unforgiving," one of the castle staff murmured from the side corridor, voice tight with apprehension, eyes flicking toward her as if measuring both her courage and her foolishness. Mara paused, hand on the railing, feeling the weight of the words settle like stones on her shoulders, and glanced toward the torchlight where shadows seemed to pool, sensing the quiet observer still present somewhere in the periphery, invisible but undeniably there. The wind tugged at her coat, carrying with it the faint tang of damp stone and pine, and she swallowed against the sudden knot of anxiety, the castle's looming walls pressing close, claustrophobic and watchful. Staff members appeared at the intersections of the corridors, murmuring warnings, exchanging quick glances as though she were a fragile figure balanced between curiosity and recklessness. Mara's fingers gripped the strap of her satchel, knuckles whitening, as she moved with cautious precision, aware of every echo, every shuffle of feet, and the barely perceptible whisper of movement behind her that signaled the silent presence still tracing her path. Each step brought new awareness of the castle's cold, hard surfaces, the stone walls slick from the evening mist, and the distant drip of water from gutters above, punctuating the quiet with a regular rhythm. Mara adjusted her pace, shifting to the lighter footfalls of careful movement, yet the tension in the air remained, coiling around her chest with every cautious breath. A staff member's voice cracked again, low and urgent. "You do not know what waits in the shadowed halls. He is a man feared by all." And Mara's pulse quickened, chest tight with the unspoken threat and the knowledge that the eyes she could not see were watching every motion. Her hair clung damply to her cheeks as she straightened, forcing herself to appear composed, but the subtle tremor in her hands betrayed the pressure mounting from the mixture of curiosity, caution, and the invisible presence. The mist swirled along the floor in ghostly eddies, catching torchlight and casting the stone in muted golden reflections, and she stepped carefully over patches of slick stone, aware of how her movement, though deliberate, might be scrutinized. The corridor opened into a wider hall, vaulted ceilings rising into shadow, and the temperature shifted, colder, more oppressive, as if the space itself demanded vigilance. Mara's breath caught as a loose stone shifted under her foot, echoing loudly, and she instinctively froze, sensing the silent figure adjusting their stance with her movements, a protective shadow just out of reach, deliberately close but remaining unseen. Her heart hammered, not with panic alone, but with the awareness of scrutiny, protection, and judgment intertwined, and she realized each careful step forward was both a challenge and a test in the unspoken dialogue that spanned the space between them. Mara's gaze swept the hall, taking in the flickering torches, the shifting shadows, and the pale light filtering through high windows, each detail anchoring her, yet amplifying the awareness of the watchful presence still unseen. She hesitated, mid-step, body poised between forward motion and retreat, chest tight, senses heightened, caught in the tension of movement and observation, curiosity and caution, knowing that every silent second in the hall was drawing her deeper into the invisible orbit of an intensity she could neither name nor fully understand, leaving her suspended in anticipation, the castle corridors holding their breath with her as the night stretched forward into uncertainty. The hall opened into a vaulted chamber where the night had settled like a heavy curtain, shadows pooling in every corner, and the air thick with the scent of damp stone and flickering torches. Mara Whitfield stepped carefully onto the polished floor, each step a deliberate measure against the echoing silence, and her fingers brushed along the cold banister, grounding her in the cavernous space. She paused near the center, noticing a small tremor of movement out of the corner of her eye, and then, almost imperceptibly, Julian Hawthorne emerged from the shadows, stepping fully into the soft glow of torchlight. "No one else understands them like you do," he said quietly, voice low and deliberate, each syllable carrying a weight that seemed to press against the stone walls themselves. Mara froze, the sound of his words wrapping around her chest, tightening and yet soothing, an intimate acknowledgment she had not expected. A flash of lightning from the storm outside illuminated the hall for a heartbeat, casting his figure in stark relief. Tall, imposing, yet with a subtle hesitation in the tilt of his shoulders that betrayed a careful restraint. Mara's breath caught, fingers clutching the strap of her satchel, eyes wide with the sudden awareness that the observer she had sensed all night was no longer distant, but here, present in the same space, a living shadow anchored to her movements. A small pebble underfoot shifted slightly, and Julian's boot appeared next to it, halting its slide, a gesture both protective and deliberate, intimate without intrusion. The wolves Mara had calmed in the courtyard were now faint echoes in her mind, the rhythmic tension of their presence replaced by the quiet intensity radiating from him. "Careful," he murmured, voice soft as silk over stone. "The hall is slick." She blinked, startled by the immediacy of the concern, and the subtle shift of proximity, the closeness pressing against her awareness, igniting a mixture of caution, curiosity, and a flutter of unexpected trust. The torches flickered, casting their reflections across polished floors, glinting off his cloak as it swirled with each slight movement, creating the illusion of motion and stillness, a silent dialogue of presence and attention. Mara swallowed, chest tightening, feeling the invisible weight of his gaze and the deliberate calibration of his actions. Each small adjustment to the environment, a claim of care that required acknowledgment yet demanded no response. The air seemed to hold its breath with them, every flicker of light, every murmur of distant rain, every subtle shift in shadow, marking the heartbeat of the room. She stepped forward, cautious, yet drawn by the unspoken gravity of his nearness, and the soft brush of his cloak against the edge of her sleeve made her pause, fingers lifting instinctively to smooth the fabric as though to test its reality. Julian's eyes remained fixed on her hands, then her face, silver light catching in the depths, reflecting an unspoken admiration that both startled and unsettled her. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of fear and recognition threading through her veins, the night holding her in suspended expectation. The hall stretched on, cavernous and echoing, shadows shifting like slow-moving waves, and the space between them felt impossibly tight yet charged, each breath a measured negotiation of proximity, trust, and unspoken connection. Mara's gaze flicked to the dark corners, then to the torchlight glinting off the stone, then back to him, and she realized with a start that the night had changed. She was no longer alone, and the observer she had felt since the courtyard was now a presence she could neither ignore nor fully understand. Her heart lifted and trembled at once, suspended in the delicate tension of closeness and curiosity, knowing that the next movement, the next word, could open a new chapter neither of them had yet dared to name. The vaulted chamber was quiet now, save for the subtle drip of water from high gutters, each drop marking the passage of time in delicate, uneven rhythms. Mara Whitfield stood in the center of the hall, her fingers still brushing along the smooth stone of the railing, a shiver passing over her as the cold seeped through her coat and into her bones. Julian Hawthorne stepped forward from the shadows, the faint glint of torchlight tracing the sharp line of his jaw and the silver depths of his eyes. "No one else understands them like you do," he said softly, his voice measured, low enough that the stone seemed to swallow the words yet carry them through the space to Mara's ears. She froze mid-motion, breath caught, pulse hammering, each syllable pressing against her chest with weight she could not fully place. The hall seemed to contract around them, the vaults above swallowing distant echoes and focusing attention solely on the charged space between them. Outside, the wind swept over the parapets, carrying the scent of wet stone and forest, brushing through Mara's hair, mingling with the warmth rising in her chest at his words. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the hall, casting stark contrast across Julian's dark cloak, the subtle movement of his body deliberate, controlled yet impossibly close. Mara's fingers tightened on the satchel strap at her side, knuckles whitening, a small tremor betraying the tension that threaded through her. The faint scrape of stone underfoot marked each of his careful steps, deliberate and measured, a rhythm that mirrored her own pulse, drawing her attention with quiet insistence. The wolf she had tended in the courtyard now seemed distant in memory, replaced by the presence of Julian, whose stillness and attention held both admiration and a subtle protective edge. A candle wavered in the draft, and Mara reached instinctively to steady it, eyes flicking to the subtle motion of his hand near the shadowed edge, halting a minor slip of a fallen pebble, unseen but sensed. The quiet intensity pressed against her skin like a living thing, wrapping her in the realization that his watchful attention was both careful and personal, measured not by fear but by a silent acknowledgment of her courage and tenderness. Mara drew a hesitant step closer, the polished stone beneath her boots echoing softly, every movement deliberate, each small motion a careful negotiation with the space and the unseen observer. Julian's eyes followed the arc of her hand, the tilt of her head, the careful breath she drew, and for a moment the hall was suspended between heartbeats, heavy with the gravity of unspoken trust. She exhaled slowly, feeling the warmth of his presence settle subtly in the air around her, a tether that pressed lightly against the tension coiling in her chest. Mara's gaze lifted, meeting the faint glimmer of silver in his eyes, and she felt the first stirrings of a fragile connection, a recognition of shared understanding and quiet admiration. Yet even as her chest eased slightly, the space between them remained charged, the hall's shadows deep, the candlelight flickering across stone and cloak, leaving her poised on the edge of anticipation. Every nerve sang with awareness, and she knew without question that this night, this chamber, this silent exchange, would mark the beginning of a revelation she could not yet name. The mist curling at the open windows, the lingering scent of rain and forest, and the quiet hum of expectation pressed against her skin, leaving Mara suspended in the hall, heart racing, body alert, and mind caught between curiosity and hesitation, knowing that the next step, the next word, the next movement, could transform the fragile balance of trust and tension into something irreversible. The chamber was hushed now, the mist lingering at the open windows like a breath held too long, curling over the polished stone floors in slow, ghostly eddies. Mara Whitfield stood near the center, her coat damp from the earlier drizzle, and she could feel the weight of Julian Hawthorne's presence, unspoken yet immediate, pressing lightly against the periphery of her senses. "You are safe here," he murmured, voice low and steady, the words carrying a gravity that seemed to settle the air around them, as though each syllable claimed the space for quiet protection. Mara's breath hitched at the subtle shift in energy, her fingers brushing against the railing for support, aware that his nearness was no longer simply observation but a deliberate, protective alignment with her movements. Outside, the wind tugged at the torches along the hall, and their flames flickered, casting rippling shadows that danced across Julian's face and the folds of his cloak, accentuating the stark silver of his eyes in fleeting glimmers. The wolves Mara had tended in the courtyard were distant echoes in her mind, replaced by the charged anticipation of the silent exchange now pressing between them. Julian stepped slightly closer, the movement deliberate, measured, yet impossible to ignore, his boots barely making a sound on the wet stone, each step a quiet signal of attention and care. Mara's pulse raced as she turned slightly, sensing without seeing the exact distance, the closeness folding the air around her into a private gravity she had not known existed. Her fingers tightened unconsciously on the satchel at her side, the leather creasing under her grip, and she felt a shiver of awareness that he could sense her hesitation, her uncertainty, and the fragile trust she was beginning to place in him. The hall seemed to hold its breath, the echoes of distant water drops and shifting mist amplifying the tension, every flicker of torchlight emphasizing the space between movement and stillness, between the spoken and the unspoken. Mara exhaled slowly, chest rising and falling with careful attention, and the subtle warmth radiating from his shadowed position made her aware of the protective cadence underlying every measured step he took. She shifted her weight slightly, the stone cold beneath her boots, and the movement caused Julian to adjust, his cloak brushing lightly against the edge of her sleeve in a ghost of contact, deliberate and unobtrusive, yet charged with unspoken intent. The wind carried the faint scent of wet pine through the open windows, mixing with the warmth of the chamber, a subtle juxtaposition that seemed to mirror the tension threading through the space between them. Mara's eyes flicked to the torchlight reflecting off the stone floor, catching the shadows and the cloak, and she felt the unspoken pause stretch, the silence thick with the possibility of confession that neither dared yet to voice. Every muscle in her body was alert, heart hammering, senses sharpened to the faintest hint of motion, the slightest change in the air, the nuanced weight of Julian's presence as it shifted imperceptibly closer, and still she did not move, rooted in anticipation and unspoken acknowledgment. The chamber seemed suspended, the mist curling like slow waves, the torchlight trembling with each draft, and Mara's mind teetered between curiosity and hesitation, fully aware that the next word, the next step, the smallest gesture, could unravel the fragile boundary between silence and revelation, leaving her suspended on the edge of a truth she had yet to claim and a connection that had begun without sound, poised on the precipice of the night's next turn. The ceremonial hall stretched wide beneath a vaulted ceiling, torchlight flickering across the polished stone and gilded tapestries that depicted centuries of royal lineage. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the great windows, rattling the panes, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost into the sacred space. Mara Whitfield stood at the center of the hall, her hands lightly resting on the carved lectern before her, eyes sweeping the gathered council, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, reverence, and anticipation. Julian Hawthorne stepped forward, every movement controlled yet impossibly commanding, his black cloak shifting around him like liquid shadow. "Stay," he said, his voice low, deliberate, reverberating through the hall, a single word that carried both protection and claim. The ancient bond words were on Mara's lips, the centuries-old syllables that had been whispered in preparation for this moment. She drew a steadying breath, feeling the weight of destiny pressing against her chest, and spoke clearly, each word resonating in the cold stone air. "By the bond of moon and blood, I claim this vow freely, heart aligned with his now and forever." A hush fell over the hall. Julian's eyes, silver and penetrating, softened for the first time, the formidable intensity tempered by the quiet surge of emotion he had restrained for so long. He knelt slowly, one knee against the polished floor, his hand rising to meet hers with a deliberate, reverent motion. "Mara," he said, voice steady yet layered with restrained emotion. "You are mine and I am yours. Always." The royal council shifted, some murmuring approval, others bowing heads in acknowledgment, while the assembled courtiers leaned forward, witnessing the sacred affirmation of bond and choice. Julian's hand wrapped around Mara's, fingers entwining in a silent promise, and he pressed his forehead gently to hers, eyes closing for the briefest moment of intimate connection, a quiet intimacy that spoke of protection, trust, and devotion beyond words. Mara exhaled, chest rising, feeling the heat of his presence and the unspoken acknowledgment that her choice, her voice, had guided this moment as much as his own decision. She lifted her gaze to the gathered assembly, seeing the hall transformed in their perception. The Alpha King's formidable aura softened only for her, his public recognition undeniable, the ceremony complete in both ritual and heart. The torches flickered as if in celebration, light glinting across the golden embroidery of Julian's cloak and the glimmer of Mara's dark hair, creating a tableau of destiny fulfilled. Outside, snow began to drift past the tall windows, each flake a quiet witness, settling along the sills as if time itself had paused to honor the moment. Julian rose slowly, keeping his hand in hers, eyes never leaving hers, and the hall seemed to exhale in collective reverence, the tension of months and years dissolving into the cathartic calm of shared recognition. Mara felt her pulse steady, the vulnerability she had carried transformed into a luminous certainty, the choice of her heart made explicit, reciprocated, and celebrated. Julian drew her slightly closer, cloak brushing against her shoulders, a subtle but unmistakable shield from the world outside, and whispered, "You are safe, always." Mara leaned into the moment, a small serene smile lifting her lips, letting the shared breath between them mark the end of uncertainty. The royal council nodded, torches flickered one last time across the hall, and Mara and Julian stood entwined, hand in hand, foreheads briefly touching, an image of quiet power, devotion, and love sealed in ritual and choice. The winter light, soft and silver, streamed across the sacred space, illuminating the Alpha King and his Omega, and for the first time, the hall felt suspended not in tension but in the serene, enduring clarity of destiny fulfilled, the sacred bond complete, and their story sealed in the eyes of all who bore witness.